Welcome to your all-inclusive seed starting guide. I'm going to cover everything that you need to know to get started with starting seeds ahead of time this year for transplant. And since we have a lot to cover, I'm going to jump right in with the very first step. Before you can get started starting seeds, you need to figure out which seeds actually need to be started ahead of time and when ahead of time they need to be started. The way that you're going to do this is you're going to take a look at the list of things that you're trying to grow, and you're going to look at how many days it takes for that plant to produce a harvest. And this gets just a slightly more complicated than looking at that number on the seed packet, unfortunately, because a lot of times the number that they give you is days till harvest after transplant, and it doesn't include that first section of time when you would be starting the seed indoors. And so when you're looking at these seed packets, just remember days till harvest and add however long ahead of time that seed packet tells you to start that seed indoors, and that gives you your total number of days till harvest. And this brings up a very good point that just because the seed packet has instructions for starting ahead of time doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do it that way. It's just a suggestion kind of based on an average of climates that they're expecting this seed to be grown in. So once you have days till harvest of all of the different stuff that you want to grow, I need you to cross-check that with the number of frost-free days that you're going to have in your growing season. And figuring that out is not as scary as it sounds, I promise. All you have to do is go into Google and type last frost date in whatever area you're in, note down that date, and then do the same thing first frost date in whatever area that you're in. And then you're going to also go into Google and say number of days between date A and date B, and that's going to spit out a number for you. If you are new to gardening, the vast majority of stuff that you're going to be looking to plant is going to be frost tender, meaning that the frost in the fall is going to kill it, or any frosts in the spring when you plant it out would kill it. So you're going to need to have it planted outside in between those dates where you know it's not going to freeze and kill your plant. There are obviously many different plants that can survive freezes and varying low temperatures, and all of that kind of depends on the variety. But for the most part in this video, we're talking about starting seeds that are frost tender, because one of the main reasons that you would be starting a seed ahead of time is to extend your season and actually have the right number of days to get a harvest here at the end before the frost comes. If you live somewhere where there's a very short season of warm, then you're gonna find that a lot of stuff that you want to grow is gonna take longer than the number of frost-free days that you have. And that is a good indication that that stuff is gonna need to be started indoors first, where you can keep it warm, and then put outside once the threat of frost is past. But if you're in a warmer place and a longer season climate like I am, I actually have way more than enough days to get a harvest off of pretty much anything that I want to plant. And so for the longer seasons, starting indoors isn't technically necessary, but depending on how warm you are, it might be more necessary to avoid the heat than it is to avoid the cold. And then lastly, even if you have the right number of days for something to produce a harvest for you, you might still want to start it ahead of time, because a lot of plants can actually produce more than one harvest if given enough time. Things that are famous for this would be like your tomatoes and your peppers, things that I know a lot of new gardeners are trying to grow. Peppers especially, if you pick all the peppers that come on your plant after the first time it makes peppers, it will actually branch out, get bigger, and make a second larger harvest. And so if you want to have time for something like that to happen, then you might still want to start your peppers ahead of time indoors, even if you technically have enough days to start it outside for the beginning. And if you're listening to me talk and you're still feeling like you're not really sure how to decide if you need to start something ahead of time indoors, let me just tell you that 99% of stuff can be started indoors, whether or not it is necessary. So you're not going to mess up by starting more stuff indoors than you actually need to. The one and only trade-off here is the amount of space that you have to give to starting stuff indoors. That is going to be your number one limiting factor, not whether or not you actually can or should be starting stuff indoors. Now, a lot of my education on this channel is a lot of giving you the tools that you need to figure things out for yourself, because me just telling you exactly what to do A, it's not going to be that effective if I live in a different climate than you, but also B, it's not going to enable you to make your own decisions and problem solve and then like evolve your strategy over time if you don't understand the core why behind what you're doing. However, I will say that when it comes to starting seeds ahead of time, there is kind of a general consensus on which ones you're going to need to start and how early you're going to need to start them. So we're going to kind of go over some of the generic stuff that people tend to do. And then I want you to take all the information that I've given you and think about that in relation to this sort of general advice. The big three that you're going to want to start indoors ahead of time are tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant. These plants can take a long time to get started, and they also all have that effect I was talking about where once you pick some of the fruit, often the plant keeps growing and will make you even more fruit the longer of a season you give it. The exception to this is tomatoes. There are two major types of tomatoes I'll go over real quick. There is determinate tomatoes and indeterminate tomatoes. Determinate tomatoes are going to grow up to a certain size and then put on all their fruit and then they will be done. But indeterminate tomatoes are going to keep growing and putting on fruit as they grow. And so the bigger the plant is, the more fruit that it's going to be producing for you. And whenever you're buying seeds on the seed packet, it should tell you if it's determinate or indeterminate. But if you actually can't find it, then just Google it and that should be pretty readily available on Google for you. There's going to be very few places in the world where starting your tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants ahead of time is going to be a mistake. Mostly that's people who are much, much closer to the equator where these plants can actually grow year round. And then at that point, the type of gardening that you're doing is very different from most of us up here in the US. After those big three, other things that you might consider starting ahead of time would be any sort of flowers that you want to grow. Marigolds might be a good one to start ahead of time indoors. If you want to grow herbs from seed, often you might want to start those indoors as well. The big herb that I always start indoors is basil, especially because it is an annual and it definitely is one of those ones where the bigger you let the plant get, the more harvest you get because, the more leaves your basil has to cut off. And as far as when to start these ahead of time, 6 to 8 weeks is the general advice that's given for most of this stuff. And that is 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. Remember at the beginning of the video, we Googled that. If you haven't done that yet, Google last frost date for your area and you will have that date and you can count back 6 to 8 weeks before that. Now, you're welcome to start it even farther ahead of time, especially if you have a short season and you really want to take advantage of all of your growing time. But as I said before, space is going to end up being your biggest problem with doing this. You can absolutely start stuff way ahead of time and have really large plants to put out when it's time to transplant. Part of making that decision is going to be figuring out just how many plants you actually need. And this, of course, ties into your overall garden planning for the year, where you kind of look at your space, you decide what you want to grow, you decide how it's going to fit into that space. If you are absolutely brand new to gardening and you want a little bit of a helping hand when it comes to actually planning your garden and making sure that you get everything right, then I actually designed a garden planner just for you. This is a PDF download that you can print out as many times as you want. So if you have a friend, it's okay, you can get one for them too, and you only have to download it once. And basically this leads you through every single step that you need to take to plan a really successful garden, including a few that I think most people leave out. So if you want to check that out, the link to download this is going to be in the description. Step 2 is supplies. What do you actually need to start seeds? We're going to start with absolutely necessary, you can't do it without this, and then move down the list to more recommended and, quality of life things that you could get, but you don't absolutely need. At the top of the list of things you absolutely do need, obviously, is a growing medium, a soil of some sort to start your seeds in. If you are absolutely brand new to gardening, if you want to just go to the store and buy the standard seed starting mix, and just be done with it, then that is absolutely okay. You'll find a lot of people talking about like complicated mixes and stuff that you can do to make your own stuff at home. But if you're brand new to this, you do not need to complicate this any more than it already is. And so just buying some actual seed starting mix is going to be absolutely fine. If you are going to be buying stuff from the store though, do make sure that it is a seed starting mix specifically and not just a normal indoor potting mix. And the reason for this is generally particle size. So a seed starting mix is going to be very fine, and that allows your seeds to sprout without anything accidentally like sitting on top of them and keeping them from being able to come up out of the soil. A lot of your indoor potting mixes, even if you don't notice it when you're handling them, they do have bigger chunks in them that can actually impede the germination of your seeds. And so if you are buying something, just buy something that is made specifically for seed starting. Hey, hi, Editing Rachel here to clarify something that I realized as I was editing that I forgot to say. So with your standard seed starting mixes, they generally don't have any nutrition in them for your plants. They are mainly formulated to help stay evenly damp for that germination. And so if you are using 100% seed starting mix, then you're going to need to plan to pot up your seedlings into something like potting soil when they get big enough. And if you were to accidentally try and plant them in like a big cup of seed starting mix and then try to grow them in that all the way up until they need to go outside in the garden, you'll find that they're very stunted. They don't get very big just because there's no actual nutrition in there for them. So definitely if you are using 100% seed starting mix, you need to make sure to plan to pot them up once they get to be about this big. If you are more advanced or you want to put a little bit more effort into it, here's my recommendation for mixing something yourself. I would recommend most of your mix being a compost, something that is really nutrient rich and is going to be high in organic matter. That's going to hold on to a lot of the moisture and make it harder for your seeds to dry out. It's also going to make it less necessary for you to pot up your plants right away because they are actually going to have a fair bit of nutrients in their little starting pot. And as I was saying before about the particle size, that actually only matters for like the top little bit where your seed is going to be planted. So you can actually get away with something chunkier in the bottom of your seed starting trays with just a little bit of something fine on the top. So that can be, again, your pre-bought seed starting mix, or it could be straight up peat moss, or just something that's really fine and is going to also hold moisture. The mix that I've been using the past couple of years is mostly just worm castings and peat moss for that top little layer. And then I'll take whatever compost I have available, and that will be kind of the lower fill. So in order of importance, after having soil to grow your seeds in, you're gonna need some sort of container for that soil. This is where people get into talking about seed starting trays. Now, I would say seed starting trays are kind of the standard, and I think they're really nice to have, but something like this isn't technically necessary for you. If you don't have the money to spend on a nice seed starting tray, you can absolutely get away with all sorts of stuff. So the cheapest option for you is going to be to go to your garden center. You can do like Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart. Most of these places have in the garden center a section where people return used trays of plants that they've bought. And it's generally like, oh, we'll take these back from you for recycling. But they also don't care if you come along and take those trays home. They're, not really any better than trash to these companies, and you can literally just take them for free. Often you don't even have to ask, you can just take them. If you're not sure where to find this, just ask somebody. Most of the time they're happy to point you in that direction. And I've actually used a lot of seed starting trays over the years that I just got from the garden center for free. Another low cost option is solo cups. I know you've probably seen a lot of people use the red solo cups to start their seeds. That is a little bit more work. You're gonna have to poke a hole in the bottom of every single one of your cups, and they're not exactly the most durable. I've been using some for like 2 or 3 years, but definitely starting to crack, and then every year I've got to throw a bunch of them out. So they won't last quite as long as something more expensive like these that are made out of a really durable plastic, but it is so much cheaper, and if that's all you can start with, then that's all you can start with, and that is absolutely okay. But if you do decide that you want to make the investment and get some trays that will actually last you for many, many years, then there are a few different traits that I want you to look for when you're purchasing. First of all, there are two generally standard sizes of trays that you're going to find. You're going to find some that are on the smaller side and some that are a little bit bigger. And obviously bigger trays take up more space per plant, but also if you're starting in these, then there's a good chance that you might not even have to pot up at all until you plant them out. So, like I said before, there's this trade-off of space versus how many plants are you actually going to need. So aside from the size, other things I want you to look for is the hole in the bottom. I have found that the ones with these bigger holes, you can see my whole finger can fit through there to help pop out the seedling when it's done. I think when you've got the harder plastic ones that are going to last a long time, if the hole in the bottom isn't good enough, you can't really crunch it to get it out the way you can those really cheap nursery pots. And so you do need a space to put your finger to press up on the block of soil to actually get your plant out. Otherwise, you're sitting here and you're hoping that this plant doesn't crumble and all four of them fall out onto the ground for you while you're trying to transplant and then snap the stems. And I've been there, done that. It is disappointing to say the least, and it's messy. And so if you can just pop your finger up in there, then that makes it a whole lot easier. You'll also see a lot of trays nowadays have these slits on the sides. This is for something called air pruning. So when the roots actually make it to the corners of these, instead of wrapping round and round the cell, the roots reach air and actually decide to stop growing in that direction. And this helps the plant get just a little bit more oxygen into the soil as well. Plants need to breathe just like we do, and we don't want them to be necessarily waterlogged and all, soggy in there all the time, so that helps with aeration as well. Other than that, the details don't really matter. Pretty much all of these trays are going to work exactly the same for you, and I don't want you to get caught up on, deciding which brand is better than this other brand. Mostly they are almost identical. I will leave you links below of the brands that I have and definitely like if you want to have a good starting spot. So things that I absolutely do not recommend that you try and use to start seeds is anything that is actually fully sealed on the bottom. I did mention solo cups, right? But I said you're gonna have to poke a hole in them for drainage, maybe multiple holes, because if you don't do that, then you're gonna have standing water in the bottom of your cup, and that's gonna cause root rot, and your plant is gonna die, and you're gonna be really sad. So make sure that whatever you're using has drainage holes in it. And I'm thinking specifically of the advice that I was given as a beginner to use an egg carton as a seed starting tray. Technically, you can find a way to make that work, but one, I think they're a bit too small to actually be all that useful, and you would have to poke holes in all of them. Not to mention, if you're using the cardboard ones, the roots will actually grow into the cardboard, and so if you're hoping to remove it from the cell and not cut the cells apart and put the whole thing in the ground, then you're going to end up ripping a lot of the roots off of your plant when that happens. I learned that the hard way. I killed a lot of seedlings thinking that I could disentangle the roots from the cardboard egg carton, and that just did not work out. So all in all, I think egg cartons, not very good for seed starting. There's plenty of other really good low cost options that I've already gone over. I would say just, don't even touch that. And because your seed starting cells are going to require drainage, then you are going to need something to catch the water that drains out of them. I don't care if it's just a plate that you put underneath it, or if it's this fancy tray that comes with your seed starting cells. But whatever setup you're using, you're gonna just want to make sure that you plan to have something to catch all of the water. And while just catching the water is the bare minimum, if you want to go one more step up, making sure that you actually do have a tray is going to be good for something called bottom watering, which I will get into more in the care of your seedlings section. But essentially pouring water into the tray and letting it seep up into the bottom of the cells rather than pouring over the top of your little baby delicate seedlings, that's just going to help keep them just a tiny bit healthier. It's absolutely not the end all be all. If you have to water from the top, that's going to be okay, and your seedlings are going to survive. But the most convenient and the ideal way to do it, if you can optimize for that, is to get a big tray where you can fill the bottom with water and then let your seedlings soak it up. The next absolutely necessary thing that you need to start seeds is some form of light. And I have to say, unfortunately, a windowsill is generally not going to be good enough. Unless you have like a dedicated sunroom where there's like an entire wall of windows, or maybe some of the roof is also windows and it's almost like a greenhouse in there. If you just have a normal window, then I do not recommend using that as your sole light source to start seeds. The reason that simply putting your plants on a windowsill isn't going to work is because the actual amount of light that can make it through that window and to your seedling, it's just not going to be enough. It will technically keep your plant alive and you might still see it grow, but it's not going to be big and strong and healthy the way that you really want it to be, especially if you're eventually planning on putting it outside. So I do recommend getting a supplementary light source of some kind, and you don't necessarily have to get stuff that's labeled as grow lights, because I think that's kind of a little overpriced. I think that they gouge you a little bit on, quote unquote grow lights. You can buy some regular light bulbs. You just have to have some specific stats that I'm going to go over right here. So the type of light bulb doesn't really matter. If it's incandescent, LED, fluorescent, that doesn't super matter. The things that do matter are the temperature. There's going to be a number on the light bulb box that says K or Kelvin, and you want that number to be above 5,000. This Kelvin number, all it's telling you is the wavelength of the light, and you want that really, really bright daylight light. So sometimes these light bulbs will also say daylight light bulbs on them. That's what you're looking for. And then beyond that, you want to look for the highest possible lumen value that you can get. So if Kelvin is the wavelength or like the temperature of the light, then lumens is the brightness. You want some very, very bright lights for starting your seedlings indoors. And the brighter you can get here, the more room you're going to have as far as how close to your plants you're actually going to need to position these light bulbs. So higher lumens is going to give you just more flexibility in that area. You can buy actual single light bulbs for this and use desk lamps to light your seedlings. I've actually done this before. I still do this from time to time. It is a really good beginner place to start out. These light bulbs are not very expensive. You can also buy like full length, like shop style lights for this. And that's really good if you think you're going to be setting up like grow shelves on a wire rack. That's a really common thing that I see. You can strap these lights to your grow rack, and then you've got a really nice setup there. And those are a little bit more expensive, but honestly not really that bad. I will put a link below for the ones that I'm currently using. Out of all of the different things that you could be spending money on in the seed starting process, I would say getting proper lights is what is going to take you the farthest as far as making sure that your seedlings are actually healthy and strong and ready to go out in the garden when the time comes. Next on the list, we do actually have to talk about heat. So a lot of seeds are not going to germinate if it's going to be too cold in your house. So a lot of people start seeds in the winter when it's cold outside, and maybe they're keeping indoors a little bit colder, and that's just not going to help your seeds germinate. You can technically get away without this one, which is why it is a little bit lower on the list. But if you can provide heat, you're going to find that you're going to get higher germination, so more of your seeds will sprout, and they will sprout faster at this warmer temperature than they would at a colder temperature. So there are a couple of different ways that you can apply heat to your seedlings. The one you're probably familiar with is a heat mat, and that is exactly what it sounds like. It is just a plastic mat that you put underneath of your seedlings. It runs a current through a high resistance wire, and that high resistance is going to put off a lot of heat as electricity goes through it. And then you've got that heat coming up underneath your seedlings and keeping them warm while they germinate. Things like heat mats are especially good if you want to apply heat to a very specific area, but they are kind of expensive and they are very, like a specialized use item. And so if you're looking at your budget and thinking you might not be able to afford that, then there's option 2. Option 2 is simply keeping the room that your seedlings are in warm. Now the heat is most important during germination, so you actually can shut your seedlings in a dark closet with a like space heater or something, make sure check for fire hazards and stuff. Like, don't be starting fires in your house over this, but you can keep them somewhere dark and small that you can keep warm with some sort of space heater. And once they just barely germinate, come out of the soil, then you can move them into your lighted setup where it's a little bit cooler, and they will generally be fine at whatever room temperature you have, unless you're somebody who's living at like 50 degrees Fahrenheit. As long as you're living at normal temperatures in your house, then your seedlings, once they're germinated, they will be fine at these slightly cooler temperatures. And because of this heat requirement while your seeds are germinating, that's why we might look again at the size of our containers. You will see a lot of people start in very small containers because it is easier to heat a small area than a larger area. And so once the seeds have germinated, they will take these little seedlings and then put them into their bigger pots where they can take up a whole lot more space, but that whole space no longer has to be heated. The ideal temperature for germination for things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, these things that we've talked about being very standard to start from seed, is going to be about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're not quite sure what the optimal germination temperature for whatever you're growing is, again, you can Google it. That information is super available to you online. Just, note it down as you're going through your seeds. Last on the list as far as supplies is something called a humidity dome. And this just kind of keeps the moisture in for your seedlings while they're germinating. I think it's potentially the least required thing on this whole list. That's why it's at the end. It is really only necessary for you if you live somewhere where it's really dry or the inside of your house is really, really dry, and you also think that you're not going to be able to check on your seedlings regularly enough to keep the top of the soil damp. In my house, humidity domes are not necessary. I've never used them, and I've always had really great success with my seedlings. However, I do live in a very humid climate. This is upstate South Carolina, and the just general baseline humidity in the air, it's pretty high. If you live somewhere like Arizona, where the air is going to be really dry most of the time, then humidity domes might be something that you want to look into. While a lot of the seed starting trays and kits will come with humidity domes, if that's not something that you're getting, you could easily just put a clear Tupperware over the top of your plants, and that will do the same exact job. I've seen people use those things, those sheet pans that you can buy, like the foil ones with the plastic top for like a cake or something, or a casserole that you're going to take somewhere. Those with the tops, that can also work perfectly well. If you are going to be using humidity domes though, I think you need to also keep a really close eye on your seedlings, because this can lead to too much humidity and you might actually end up killing off your plants with too much of that moisture. So you want to keep a really close eye if you are using the humidity domes, and once your plants have germinated, then you're going to want to take the humidity domes off. All right, as I was collecting my stuff to go outside, I realized there are two other supplies that you might want to think about, but are definitely not necessary for starting seeds. The first one is seed tags, plant tags, these little plastic things that you write on to label your plants. I think they're not necessary. I think they're pretty and cute, and they're kind of nice to have. But if you are on a budget, you do not absolutely need them. You do need to label your plants, but that can be just as easy as taking a sheet of paper and drawing out your seed starting setup and then just labeling them on that sheet of paper so that you know what's what. It can be just that simple. These are a little nicer if you're kind of a messy person and you want to be able to pick up the plant and put it somewhere else and still know what it is. Then maybe you need to get a tag. But on top of that, I would say that you do not need to buy new tags every year. This is my cup of reused tags. And I basically, there's whatever last year was on there. I will turn it over and do that, use the opposite side. And a lot of times the labels fade over time. So sometimes I'll just write over the faded label and use it again. Really, they don't have to be pretty. If you really care about making it pretty and using fresh ones, you can absolutely do that. But that is not something that is super necessary for you. So the other thing that I will be using on my seedlings that I think is nice to have, but absolutely not required, you don't need this in order to be successful. I have gone many years without it, although I will say it is nice and it does make your plants just a little bit stronger, a little bit hardier. They go through transplant better if you can get this, is organic Rev. Now this is concentrated microorganisms that are going to be beneficial for your plant. Plants actually form a lot of relationships with microorganisms in the soil, and they work hand in hand to keep each other healthy. And so this is kind of like an inoculation of a bunch of those beneficial microorganisms so they can start forming a relationship with your plant really early on. And this is going to make your plant stronger in pretty much every way, and your plants will probably grow faster too if you can use something like this. But like I said, I've gone years without it and it's absolutely not necessary. If it is something that is in your budget though, I do have a link below for you to go ahead and grab that at 10% off. So I actually don't have any compost available to use right now, unfortunately, and that is poor planning on my part, but I do have just some standard potting mix, and that is going to work out fine for the bottom layer of my cups. Remember, I said we definitely need a specific seed starting mix or something really fine to go over the top little layer, but for most of the fill, this potting mix is going to be fine. And if you take a close look at this right now, it's actually pretty dry. It's very fluffy. And so what I've done is I've filled it pretty much all the way to the top. And I am going to get this wet, and that's going to cause it to kind of settle and compress. And we're going to just gently press the soil into the cups, and that's going to leave us just a little bit of space at the top to go ahead and fill with our seed starting mix. As you're pressing the dirt down into the cells, you want to press firmly, but you don't want to pack it in super hard. You just need to use some gentle pressure to help the soil settle, but we're not trying to actually physically pack it in there. And since this is chunky potting soil that I'm using for that bottom layer, I want to make sure to kind of remove the most chunky pieces as they arise so that none of them are going to end up near the top. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add my seed starting mix on top, and usually I don't actually buy seed starting mix, but somebody had some extra that they weren't going to use and they gave it to me, so I might as well get it used up. And when I'm done filling this, you're going to see the difference in the texture between this stuff and the potting soil that is underneath. It is pretty obvious once you see it. Now that this second layer is on, I'm going to press again into the tops of the cells, but again, it is just a gentle pressure. We're helping everything settle in. We are not pressing down with our full might, just a little bit to kind of help it settle and make sure that there's no big air gaps anywhere. And as I'm going, if I do find any big gaps where it like unexpectedly settles pretty far, I'll just come back and add a little bit more of the seed starting mix to kind of fill that in. Last thing I'm going to do is kind of tap at the tops like this, and that just helps jostle everything into place, and it gives me like a nice flat surface over the top so that we don't have anything piled up too high, and then I can see very easily if there happen to be still any more wells that need filling. Now, before I put any seeds in here, I'm going to make sure that the soil that I'm using is really nice and moist. Usually, if you've just bought fresh soil, it'll come from the store very moist, but since this stuff is older, it's lost a lot of its water, and I'm going to need to rehydrate it a little bit before I can plant anything in it. So I'm just going to go ahead and saturate all of this gently with water and let it sit and soak up all of that water before I start planting seeds in it. We're going to do it all again with this newer tray, and then I will see you inside for the actual planting of the seeds. That afternoon sun really is getting bright back there, but we are still going to try and get the seeds planted. And I have my handy dandy Sharpie, which is my tool for pretty much everything, and I want to talk to you about actually getting the seed in the dirt, because it might seem easy, but there actually is a wrong way to do this. So the first thing I usually do is I make a little bit of a divot with my Sharpie. You can do this with the tip of your finger too, doesn't really matter. The depth of the divot is going to depend on the type of seed that you're planting, and this is where it gets pretty important to pay attention. So seeds have like a certain size, right? And you do not want to plant your seeds any more than double as deep as they are big. So for these little baby ones, we're just making tiny little divots in the soil. If you were planting something really big, like a pea or a bean, you could plant it like this far into the soil. And the reason for that is these little baby seeds only have so much energy to do their initial germination, to get their leaves out and get the sunlight. And if they have to go too far through soil before they reach sunlight and can begin photosynthesizing, then they will run out of energy and they will never be able to grow. So they need to be deep enough to be able to get a good root set down and stay damp. That's why we don't set them just on top of the soil, but they do need to be shallow enough that they can still get to the surface with the energy that they have stored in their little shell. As far as how many seeds to plant, here is my advice. So say I want 3 tomato plants from each variety that I'm planting. I'm going to plant 6 cells worth of seeds, so that's double as many as I need, because I know some of them aren't going to do very well, and the same's going to happen for you, and that's not going to be your fault. You will have stronger plants and weaker plants, and if you have the space, you'd like to be able to choose out like the 3 strongest plants from a whole set. And then additionally, in every single cell, I'm going to put 2 or 3 seeds. That way I guarantee that every cell is going to have at least 1 plant come up in it. And then from there, it really is just as simple as dropping the seeds in the hole and then very, very gently covering them up with soil. You want to press down on them just enough to make sure that the seed is making contact with the soil, because that's how it's going to get its moisture and its nutrients right there at the beginning. So you want it to have good contact, but again, we don't want to pack it in super hard. Once you've got your seeds planted, you're going to want to set them up in your grow setup. And the next thing to consider here is how close are you putting your seedlings to the lights? This is going to depend a little bit on how strong your lights are, how many lumens they have. In general, the stronger the light is, the farther away from it you can put your plants. If you don't put your plants close enough to the light, they will tell you. And by that I mean that the plants who don't get enough light will stretch out because they're reaching for more light, right? And that's what we call leggy. And so if you start seeing your seedlings get kind of tall and skinny and looking weak but tall, then that is leggy. We can just avoid this at the start by making sure that our plants are close enough to our grow lights. Most of the time, for most setups, you're going to want them as close to the light as you can get them. It's with the sorts of light bulbs that you can buy, you're going to have a hard time finding a light bulb that is so strong that you can't put it right up next to it. As your plant gets bigger over time, as it grows, you can move it just a little bit farther away from the light because we don't want it crowding all the way up into and touching the light. But you do want to keep them very close in with that light. On my setup, you can see I have some lights hanging down more than others, and ideally I would have them all at the same level, but just the way that I had to attach these, I had to kind of stagger them so that they're stacked a little bit, so some are higher than others. But if you can get away with it, I think having them even is definitely the goal. All right, it's the next day, and now we need to go over how to care for and maintain your seedlings as they're germinating and also after they've germinated and started to become little plants. While you're waiting for your seeds to germinate is the most important time to be paying attention to the moisture in the soil. You want to avoid the soil ever drying out while also avoiding it being fully flooded. When you press your finger gently onto the top of the soil, you want it to feel damp, but you don't want water to squish out of it as if it's a very wet sponge that is like leaking water. A lot of times you can see a color difference in wet versus dry soil, and this can also be a good indicator of when you need to water. I do highly recommend bottom watering, which means just pouring water in the tray that your seedlings are sitting in and letting the water soak up from below. This can completely avoid the problem of disturbing the seeds in the soil. If you're willing to be very gentle though, you can actually water from the top. I find that I don't really have the patience for that though, and it is just so much easier and faster to pour water into a tray. If you are following along with me and using the organic rev with your seedlings, this first watering is really the time to be giving it to them. I pour just a splash of it in here and then dilute the whole thing with just normal tap water. At this stage of the process, I find that watering them thoroughly once per day is plenty. Sometimes they don't even need it every day. Sometimes it can be every other day, but this can vary depending on the humidity that's in the room that you're keeping your seedlings. If you're finding that the top of the soil is drying out within just a few hours, then you might want to consider the humidity domes that I mentioned earlier. If you find that the top of the soil is still damp about 48 hours after the last time you watered, then I think that's a sign that you gave it too much water all at once, and you might want to back that down a bit. Last night and this morning, I noticed that my seedlings were starting to sprout, so it's the perfect time to talk about the next thing you're going to have to do to maintain the health of your seedlings. If you've ever owned a houseplant, then you might already know this, which is that plants that are kept indoors in like very still air environments tend to make very weak stems. And sometimes it takes just a little bit of violence to make your plant stronger. Plants take so many cues from their environment, and they don't want to spend unnecessary energy on things that aren't going to really matter to them. But we are starting our plants in a different environment than where they're eventually going to live, which is outside. And inside is very, very safe, and there's not a lot of wind. And so your plant isn't going to know that it needs to spend the energy making a really strong, sturdy stem to withstand the wind. So we have to kind of simulate that indoors so that your plants know what they're getting into from the beginning. So you have a couple different options when it comes to providing this fake wind. The first and most obvious one is fans. You can definitely set a little fan to kind of gently blow your seedlings around. You don't want it to be like full blast blowing on your seedlings all the time. That's a little too much. Just a gentle little breeze is good for these teeny tiny plants. The second option that you have, if you don't really have the ability to set up a fan in your space, kind of like I would need to put like maybe a whole extra shelf out here to really get some wind going. What I do is I come around and I just brush the tops of my little plants a few times a day, and that does a fairly good job of simulating the wind and encouraging them to grow really strong stems. So you might also notice that my tomatoes have sprouted, my basil has sprouted, but my eggplant and my peppers are still nowhere to be seen. And that is actually perfectly normal. Tomatoes tend to sprout just a little bit quicker than your peppers and your eggplants. Eggplant and pepper are a little bit more sensitive to having heat while they're germinating, and so the fact that I don't have them directly on a heat pad is going to mean it takes just a little bit longer for them to germinate. Now this room I'm standing in is actually very hot. I have had the heat on in this specific room, and It's almost 80 degrees in here, but that's still not quite as good as having a heat mat, and just that little bit of a difference will add a couple more days to the germination time, which is not normally a very big deal at all. And I would not stress out about it. If you are starting seeds for the first time, it's taking a little bit longer, do not stress about it. I promise. It's probably going to be just fine. And if you remember, I planted multiple seeds in each cell as we were starting the seeds, and we're now starting to see multiple plants coming up in the same cell. Now, this is only a tiny bit of a problem. Generally, you do want to have just one plant per cell, and so you have a couple different options of how to deal with that here as well. The first option you have is culling, so that is just getting rid of the extra seedlings that you don't want. And the easiest way to do this is to take a tiny pair of scissors and just like snip off the stem of the plant that you don't want. You can do this at any point, but I would recommend waiting until the plants get their first true leaves so that you can have a better idea of which plant is going to be a little bit stronger. The other option you have is just letting both of them grow, and when you go to transplant your plants and pot them up, then you can separate them. And especially for tomatoes, I will say they transplant very easily. So if you have to separate seedlings, then you probably will still be able to save both of them if you're careful. While your seedlings are still really small like this, you'll find that the watering schedule stays about the same, although you will see a little bit of an acceleration of how much water they need the bigger they get. But right now, generally your watering strategy is going to be about the same. You might also be noticing during this time that some of your seedlings still have the little seed casing attached to the tips of their leaves, and some of them do not. And the ones that still have it attached, generally it's not a problem, but occasionally you will find that they get fully stuck in there and they don't ever fully break out of that. Generally, this is only a minor problem at best. I would say 90% of the time when you see this, the plant will fix itself all on its own. But if you find that the seed cap is kind of sitting on top of the stem and there's no visible leaves, then those are the ones that tend to be a little bit more of an issue. And if you have a lot of that, then that can be an indicator that you didn't keep your soil quite damp enough as the seeds were germinating, because the dampness in the soil really loosens the seed cap off of the leaves as the plant is emerging from the soil. So that is just an indication that your soil is a little too dry. And I would say sometimes those seedlings can be saved, but the majority of the time, they're not going to do so well if they're like still fully capped with no leaves visible. If there are leaves visible at all, generally your plant will end up doing okay. You can very carefully tug the little seed cap off. I've seen some people use their spit to kind of soften the seed cap and help it slide off naturally. And sometimes, even if the plant doesn't fully get rid of its seed cap, it can still kind of fold it out of the way and the true leaves can still come out around it, and that ends up being fine as well. So again, to be more clear, just one or two of your seedlings kind of has the cap really stuck, that's just bad luck. If like more than like 40 or 50% of them have the little seed cap fully stuck on them, then I would start thinking that your soil is just a little bit too dry. It's a couple days later, and now I want to show you an example of some of the plants are getting enough light and some of them are not quite getting enough light, and I want to show you what to look for. If you look at my light setup, you can see I have this one lower and then I have two on either side that are a little higher up. And if you remember, I didn't do this on purpose because I thought it was good. I did it because that's how I could fit all the lights in my shelf. And you can definitely see that because not all the seedlings are as close to this lower light, we are getting a little bit of bending. So this one here on the end, you can see how it's bending inwards towards this light that is lower. Even though it has a light right here above it that is the same strength, it wants to go to this one that is closer to it. And so what we might see is that this stem stretches out a little bit and gets what we call a little bit leggy. So I would say these seedlings are good examples of ones that are getting enough light. You can see that they're growing straight up towards the light. They're not bending in any direction like these ones are. And they're not too tall right now. You know, they're only a couple knuckles high, and that's about what I would expect for tomatoes at this stage. So to better understand why your plants need to be closer to your light source, let's take a look at this example. So what we have over here is a light that is pretty far away from the plants. And if we imagine light coming out from the light bulb in a cone, like so, right? We can see that as the light comes out from the light bulb, it spreads out. And if you remember from your high school physics class, light is made up of photons, individual particles, right? And so the number of photons coming out right here is going to be the same number of photons that are out here. They're just going to be more spread out. So for the sake of simplicity, we'll assume that there's just 10 photons coming out of this light bulb. So we've got our 10 photons up here, and by the time they get out here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? So we've got our 10 photons hitting our plants. And you can see in this example, each plant is getting about 1 photon on its leaf. But if we go up and look at this other example where the light is much closer, our light comes out in a cone, kind of more like this. I've got the angle a little bit wrong. The light comes out like this. And so the same number of photons, we say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so in this case, what we're seeing is each plant is getting about 2 photons on its leaves instead of 1. And that's about double, and that would make sense because it's about half as close as the other one. What we also see is this plant over here on the end, this plant over here on the end, not really getting very much of that light because it is so concentrated in the center here. And so that's why my plants are doing a little bit of one of these, because they would really like to be getting those photons. So even though I have all the way up here these extra lights, right? They are so far away that their little cones aren't necessarily getting enough photons to this plant. This plant could get like half a photon over here, or if it bends this way, it could be getting 2 photons over there. And so that's why we see these plants curling in towards the center light instead of growing straight up towards the light that's a little bit farther away. So we are about 20 days after I initially planted those first seeds, and I wanted to show you what the growth I'm seeing actually looks like, how big the plants are, and also start talking about some troubleshooting if you have run into problems. These are the tomatoes. You can see they've gotten really big really fast. They are actually running into the lights, and that is part of why I have them up on something instead of having the lights permanently much lower, because once they get bigger, I'm gonna need to put the tray lower so that they're not running into the lights. However, these are also at about the size where I would start transplanting them into bigger pots. And let me show you how to tell if something is big enough to transplant. All right, so if we look at this tray right here, you can see our plants and our roots. And the biggest thing you want to look for to know if a plant is too big for its current pot is I want you to imagine taking that plant, pulling it out of its pot, and turning it upside down and trying to put it back in the pot. And I want you to think about, would the foliage fit in the pot that it's in? Because what we know about most plants is that the root system underneath the soil is generally comparable to the amount of foliage that we see above the soil. And so if you couldn't take the plant and turn it upside down and put it back in its container, then it's probably getting a little too big for the container. The roots probably could use a little bit more room. I have a video on my channel that talks in depth about how exactly to transplant your tomato seedlings, and I will link that up here for you. In the rest of this tray are basil seedlings and a couple of other plants, and you can see this is looking pretty barren. You know, the seeds that germinated look great, but I have a lot of empty cells. And this is a problem that you might run into. It's low germination, so low sprouting of your seeds, and that can happen for a number of reasons. Sometimes when you see low germination, it might be because it's not quite warm enough or wet enough. So if it's kind of chilly or your seeds are drying out, they might not germinate. Another reason that you might see low germination is if your seeds are a little older. If you have seeds older than a year or two, then the germination rate is going to go down. Now, some seed packets do have expiration dates, and I think that you should generally ignore that number, because past that date does not mean that your seeds will not sprout. It just means that fewer of those seeds will sprout, and so you might want to plant extra seeds to ensure that you're getting a good germination rate and you're getting the number of plants that you want. How old is too old? Well, it really depends on the seed that you're using. We have successfully sprouted beans that are like multiple thousands of years old that we've found in caves. But at the same time, sometimes carrots won't germinate if they're more than a year old. So it really is a huge range, and different types of plants have different ranges on how long they will still be viable after they've been saved. And so if you are struggling with that, you might go ahead and look up online what the general range is for the plant that you're looking at. Something else that might cause your seeds to not germinate is if they are a specialty kind of seed, seeds that need special conditions to sprout. So most seeds that you're going to be starting are going to want warmth and damp soil, and that's pretty much it. But some seeds need a little bit of extra. Some seeds, like the chamomile that I'm trying to sprout, it actually needs light to germinate. So if I was to bury that seed in the soil at all, it probably wouldn't germinate. I need to press it very gently into the top of the soil so that it can get light to germinate. Another thing that you might see is scarification might be necessary for some seeds, and that is like kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's like a slight cutting or, a little bit of damage to the seed pod that is necessary to stimulate that seed to feel like, okay, it's time to sprout. And in a similar vein, some seeds need stratification, which is a period of cold before that seed knows that it's time to germinate. So if you had one of those seeds and it had never gotten cold before, it would go in the ground and still think that it's waiting for winter to pass before it can sprout, and it might never come up. So definitely look into some of the special considerations you might need to take for more unusual seeds. But the tomatoes, peppers, eggplant that we've been talking about, they don't need any of those special things. Something else I want to point out is the size difference between my tomatoes and my eggplant. These were planted on the same day, and the tomatoes sprouted faster, which means they've had more time to grow. And what tends to happen with seedlings is they spend a lot of time in this little baby stage, and then once they start getting their first true leaves, and that is any leaf after the little sprout leaves, once they start getting their true leaves, the growth feels a little exponential. And that makes sense if you think about it, right? Because they've got, at this point, double the number of leaves that are photosynthesizing for them. So they've got double the energy to put into growing more. And the more and more leaves that they put on, the faster they can grow because they have more and more energy. And so that's why these that might have sprouted only a few days before these are just so much bigger, because they've had time to kind of start exponentially growing, whereas these guys are just now getting started with some of that. It is also worth noting that eggplants and peppers, they do get started just a little bit slower. It takes them a little longer to germinate, and they also don't exactly explode quite as fast as tomatoes. Tomatoes are very fast to grow. Peppers and eggplants, they're just a little bit slower, and that is normal. So don't be concerned if they're just a tiny bit slower as well. This is why you'll often see people starting tomatoes maybe 6 weeks before they need to go out, and then people will start peppers and eggplants 8 to 12 weeks before they need to go out, just because they are a little bit slower to get started. Another thing that you might see happening with your seeds is algae growing along the top of the soil. You can kind of see that green there, and you can see the difference between that and the soil over here. The algae is not really a problem. It looks like it is a problem because it's only on the cells that didn't really grow anything. But I do want to remind you that algae is a plant that needs sunlight. And so over here, there's a little bit, if you look really close, but it's essentially been shaded out by the tomatoes, and it just can't grow there because something else is taking its light. And it looks prolific here because it is getting unobstructed access to the light from the grow lights. Another common problem that people run into is something called damping off. And this is when your plant kind of sprouts and then sort of seems like it wilts for no reason, right? It's got plenty of water and it looked really healthy, and then it just kind of dies. And one of the reasons for that is damping off, which is a process that happens when the plant is too wet. That's why it's called damping off. And basically it's just the right conditions start existing for a certain microbe that ends up coming in and overwhelming your little baby plant. So part of what you need to be looking for as you are keeping track of your seedlings is balancing that humidity. You want the soil to stay damp, but you don't want it to be overly damp because you don't want to encourage this kind of microbial growth that could damp off your seedlings. And so that's where you have to be really careful with using humidity domes in a place like where I am, where it's already like really humid in the environment. Is I can very easily get damping off by keeping my plants far too moist. Something else that you might see happening with your seedlings is seedlings getting leggy. And we've already talked about this. We've talked about why this happens, but what if it did happen to you? What if you have leggy seedlings? Is there anything that you can do about that to fix it? Well, it depends on the type of seedling that you have. Some plants are very sensitive to how deep they are in the soil, and you cannot plant them any deeper to kind of get rid of that legginess. But other plants, they don't really care, and some of them are actually really well disposed via evolution to put out new roots along their stem if that stem comes in contact with the soil. So tomatoes are an excellent example of this. All the little hairs that you might see on the stems of your tomatoes, those are actually like precursors to roots. And so tomatoes naturally in the wild, what they would do is they would kind of grow up these vines and then flop over on the soil, and then anywhere it was touching the soil, it would put down new roots. And so tomatoes specifically, you can plant basically as deep as you want. You obviously do want to still have some of the leaves poking out so that it can photosynthesize. But traditionally, you will find a lot of people talking about planting tomatoes deeper, not just to get rid of that legginess, but also to provide a sturdier plant with more roots that can then, grow more fruit for you during the season. So tomatoes specifically, they are quite good at this. If you have leggy tomatoes, when you transplant them, just plant them deeper and I promise they will be absolutely fine. But if you do find that you have leggy seedlings, again, that is an indication that they're not getting enough light. So you will want to remedy the light situation as soon as you can. And when it comes to peppers and eggplant, I found that both of those also do tolerate being planted a little bit deeper. Peppers will do a little bit of putting out fresh roots if you plant them a little bit deeper. Eggplant, not so much, but it won't necessarily die if you plant it too deep, like some plants. A good example of a plant that you do not want to plant any deeper would be onions. Onions make a bulb, right? And if you put them too deep in the soil, that bulb will be kind of crushed by all the soil around it and it won't be able to get very big. So your plant might live, but you won't get a really good onion. And that's why a lot of times if you see pictures of onions growing, they look like they're half sticking up out of the soil. And that is intentional. That is so that the bulb has plenty of room to expand and actually get to that size that you would want it to be. And again, I know I sound like a broken record, but for the different types of plants you're growing, it is always really useful to go ahead and check the internet and see what the guidelines are for the depth of planting of all of those. The last thing I'm going to discuss before we end this video is how to get your seedlings from this stage all the way out to in your garden. And it is sort of simple. It is, you know, taking the plant and popping it out of its container and actually planting that in the dirt in your garden. But there is one crucial step in between there that if you miss it, you might end up with dead seedlings in your garden, even if you did everything else correct. This in-between step is called hardening off, and that is where you get your plant that has been inside in these really controlled conditions used to the outside conditions. And that can be like the windiness and the light, and usually it's getting a little colder at night outside than it will inside where you started your seeds. And that's the big thing that you need them to get used to. So sunlight usually and the cold at night is what the plants need to get used to. So if you put them out just from inside straight to outside all the time, you might find that either some of the leaves get sunburned because they're not used to all that sunlight, and they'll get little crispies on the edges, and they might recover from that, but it's definitely a setback that you don't want to have happen. And similarly, if it gets a little too cold at night, the plant might be confused and it might also stunt the growth of the plant. So the way that we remedy this is we start to slowly introduce them to outside temperatures. So when it's getting close to time for these to be planted out, what I'll do is I'll take the tray and I will go set it outside. And the first day I will set it outside for like an hour. And often I'll set it in the shade in the middle of the day. So it's nice and warm. It's getting actual sunlight, but not like directly on it. You can also do this with direct sunlight in like the morning or the evening, where it's going to be a little less intense. And as you go through the days, you'll put them out for longer and longer. And you'll also have to keep track of the temperature at night, because eventually you do want to be leaving them outside 24/7 for a couple of days before they actually get planted in the ground. And you want to make absolutely sure during this time that it is not getting cold enough to really hurt your plants at night. Generally, in the time when I would be hardening off my tomatoes, I will be hardening them off over a period of a couple of weeks. And during those couple of weeks, I might get 1 or 2 kind of late frosts that I definitely want to avoid killing my tomatoes with. So just keep an eye on the weather, and at least a week of hardening off before you put them outside. I like to go up to 2 weeks. One, because it's just a little safer, and also because it's hard to know exactly when the weather is going to clear up for me to be able to put them outside and not worry about them dying. So I like to have them kind of ready to go, already hardened off, and then when the weather is right, I can just put them straight outside. So if you guys have any questions at all about all of that, leave them in the comments below. I do check my comments, I do respond to them, so if you have questions, I will do my best to help you out. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy gardening!